everyone. Welcome to a special GZERO live stream, High and Dry, Tackling Global Water Stress. I'm Shari Friedman, Managing Director of Climate and Sustainability at Eurasia Group. This program is presented in partnership with Suntory Holdings and the Sustainability Leaders Council, which was founded by Eurasia Group and Suntory in 2021. The Council's goal is bringing together global leaders from multinational institutions, governments, and the private sector to create blueprints for tackling some of the world's biggest challenges in environmental sustainability. Today's topic is certainly one of them. In a lot of ways, it's a matter of life or death. A lot of us take water for granted, covers more than 70% of the planet, but fresh water for drinking, cooking, and farming is depleting at alarming rates. UNICEF reports that today as many as 4 billion people, which is about half of the world's population, experience at least a month of severe water scarcity each year. 2 billion people live in places where water supply is inadequate all year, and it's getting worse. By 2030, water scarcity could drive as many as 700 million people to migrate. For more on why we're having this conversation today, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Frank Bagadi, Director of Sustainability at Eurasia Group, who thinks a lot about this issue. Frank, you've covered the issue of water extensively. So could you tell us a little bit about the conversations that we're going to have over the course of this hour?
Absolutely. Thank you, Shari. Shari, as you know very well, this year with Eurasia Group, we decided to put water stress as one of our top 10 big global risks of the calendar year of 2023. Sad to report that we were right, and the year really showed just that. And that's one of the reasons why we decided, as part of our activities with the Sustainability Leaders Council, to have our annual live stream event specifically focused on this global issue, water stress. And for that, we decided to have a three-part conversation focusing on what we call the 3 S's. So first, the science, because we want to lay the foundation. We want to have the numbers. And we want to make sure that we have the facts right for the remaining of the conversation. Second, the scope, because we want to better understand the real-life implications, the real-life impact of the global water stress crisis. And then last but not least, the solutions, whether there are existing solutions that we could scale up or exist solutions that could kind of like be imagined or thought about as part of this conversation, and that some of our viewers could then take home and try to implement themselves. And Shari, let's get started with the science part. For that, I would love to bring in Brian Richter. Brian is a global leader on this issue. He has been for more than 2 decades now. He's currently the president of Sustainable Waters, which is a platform that provides accurate and up-to-date information about water scarcity. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
First question to you. We all know this big number, 8 billion. The global population just reached that milestone a few months ago. This means huge pressure on an already strained resource, which is water. But why is it that water is still viewed by so many as an invisible crisis?
Well, it really relates to the fact that we're so heavily dependent upon the available water resources in many regions. Shari mentioned some of the statistics. So, our estimates are that about 1/3 of all the planet's rivers and lakes and aquifers are being so heavily used that we're really getting into a lot of trouble. We're experiencing a lot of water shortages. And this phenomena happens simply because the population is using the water faster than the rate it's being replenished. And so as Shari said, about half of the world's population is now experiencing the terrible experience of water shortages.
When we look at that situation and how critical that is, we know it's a global issue, but if you kind of like try to focus on specific regions, are there some regions that you are a bit more concerned about? And if so, which are those?
Yes, well, certainly, I'm from the United States, and certainly the western half of our country is dealing with this problem almost every day now. There's some pretty iconic river systems like the Colorado River or the western U.S. That people are very, very concerned about. A lot of farmers are already being shut off of their water supplies because of it. But there's many, many other regions. There are areas, the North China Plain, certainly, many parts of India are experiencing a lot of problems. There are pockets within the Middle East, Northern Africa. These problems actually, though, Australia, I should mention, is really struggling in a couple of places. These problems can actually pop up in some of the wetter places on the planet, and that's something that not a whole lot of people understand. I live in an area that, by all measures, is quite wet, and we get a pretty even rainfall throughout the year. And yet, there are times when you have a drier period, you have a drought, and all of a sudden, if the community has become so dependent upon that local water supply, and then all of a sudden there's less water being replenished, you can get into trouble very, very quickly. Just about 20 years ago, our local reservoirs were within 30 days of going dry. So it's not just South Africa that has the day zero experience of getting close to running out of water. It can happen in some of the Sao Paulo, Brazil. Who would have thought that a place that wet could experience problems?
I mean, I think you're raising a really good point, because it's not necessarily, in some places it's definitely increasing scarcity, but a lot of it is general mismanagement of water, and a lot of places haven't had to think about it. So, and I've heard you say this in different form, where we could really be doing a lot better, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in improving. So when you think about this, where do you go first? Where's the first action for the low-hanging fruit?
Sure. It's a great point. And there is, I should dispel a pretty widespread misconception about where the most water gets used, because most people, my friends, colleagues that I speak with, they think that the problem is the rapidly growing population in large urban areas, and that they're expanding so quickly and they're putting stress on the water resources. And that's absolutely the case. But it turns out that many, many cities around the world are really pushing forward on water conservation measures. And I've written a couple of papers recently about areas in the United States that the population has grown very rapidly, 30 or 40% over the last couple of decades. And yet the city, because of their very wise conservation investments, have been able to keep their water use stable or actually decrease even while their population is going up. We refer to that in our community, in our science community, as decoupling population growth from water needs. So the big gorilla here, if you will, is really the use of water for irrigated farming. Irrigated farming is responsible for consuming about 90% of all the water that we use on the planet. And so, Shari, if we're going to talk about low-hanging fruit, and it's not easy to conserve water in irrigated farming, but that's where the most of the water is being used. So anything that we can do to reduce that need to grow our food, then that's going to be very, very important. And so our research group has been paying a lot of attention to the different means by which farmers can reduce their use of water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is going to be coming up in one of the panels that Frank is going to be talking about with Alzbeta Klein.
Absolutely, it's going to be right with our next panel. Brian, I had another question for you. We already know that for 2023, the outlook was quite green when it comes to water supply. What is the outlook for 2024? What can we expect next year in terms of the water supply challenges across the world?
Well, it's very interesting. We're experiencing an El Nino event, which can play out in can exacerbate, can cause some extreme conditions particularly in selected regions around the planet. There are some places that get a lot more precipitation, a lot more rainfall or snowfall, and there's other places that get a lot drier during that. So it looks like that El Nino is going to persist for a little while longer. Certainly we're kind of in the midst of it now, but it looks like 2024 will start with that situation. And as we look over the longer term, I think that's where we need to keep our eyes, on the ball here, because climate warming is presenting some huge challenges with water availability. In many of the places that I was talking about that are experiencing scarcity presently, that challenge is going to worsen quite.
I think
coming decades. So I mentioned the Colorado River in the American West previously. They're already struggling, having terrible water shortage problems already. They expect that by the year 2050, we could have between 20 and 30% less water in that river system because of climate warming. And so we have to start adapting to this really, really fast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Maybe one final question for you. We know that the crisis is getting worse by the day and that we should be looking at the longer term perspective. Is there a point of no return? And if so, which one is that?
Oh boy. I a lot of my friends ask me, how in the world, Brian, can you stay an optimist? And I say, well, because we're managing and using water so poorly, there's a lot of room for improvement. So that's what I hang my hope on, is that we can make some changes. And I do. So to answer your question more directly, I do have faith that we're going to adapt. As some of my colleagues, including James Dalton, who you speak with later on in this show, one of the things that really strikes us and frustrates us is that the water situation, important changes aren't made in our policy or our management of those water resources until things get very, very bad. Until we get into real crisis, really dangerous situations before we're motivated to do that. I think by extension, you could say the same about climate change. And so it's very unfortunate. I wish we could be more proactive. And maybe we will learn to become a little bit more, get on the ball a little bit earlier. But that's the situation. But I do hold out hope. We're going to be able to adapt. It could be painful in the meantime.
Yeah, it's interesting you say this, because this is very much in line with the way that Frank had noted this was one of our top risks. But the being behind the ball on the government management is what's causing, from a political place, a lot of the risk, which is what Frank has identified. Very much in line.
Absolutely, Shari.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, thank you for sharing your expertise today. Shari, we'll see you again later in the hour. Meanwhile, ahead of this live stream, GZERO spoke to some of the partners involved in the Sustainability Leaders Council. And here is Rohitesh Dhawan, President and CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals.
Hi, I'm Rohitesh Dhawan, President and CEO of ICMM. Water is probably the most urgent concern for the planet because it's highly local. We've gotten used to issues like climate change where they're fungible. In other words, you reduce emissions in one part of the world to make up for higher emissions in a different part of the world. You simply can't do that with water because it's needed where it is found and where it is used. And so saving water in one place helps nobody on the other side of the world. And as a result, the challenges and solutions for water end up being very, very local. And the final dimension for why water is so important is because not only is it key in the way we use it, but it often has really important intangible connections to the lives, cultures, traditions, and customs of people, particularly indigenous peoples. And our economic system is not very good at valuing those things. For the mining and metals industry, water is absolutely essential, not just to what we do in producing metals and minerals that are used in the global economy, but to our relationships with our local communities and our near neighbors. And so not only do we want to make sure that there's enough water that we need to continue our business, but equally importantly, if not more importantly, we need to make sure that the lives of people that live around our operations and the amount of water they need to ensure happy, healthy lives are taken care of and are not jeopardized by the use of water in the mine. The mining industry has been really focused on making sure that we measure and report our impacts on water as robustly and as clearly and transparently as we possibly can. If there was one thing that I could encourage everybody to do, not just in our industry, but in any industry, it would be to report your water impacts, particularly in water-stressed regions. And if you wanted to be a leader, you could go beyond that by not just reporting that for the operational water that you use, but also for the managed water. In other words, all the water you come into contact with, whether or not you use it. That is what we are striving for. That is the expectation that ICMM has of all of its members. But I really hope that everybody embraces this challenge of water reporting and measurement, because that is the first step to be able to manage it responsibly.
And welcome back. If you are just joining us, I am Frank Bagidi, and this GZERO live stream is exploring the current state of water stress globally. We know that more than 25% of the world's population is currently facing extreme water shortages. Overconsumption and climate change could also catalyze a full-blown crisis. We've just heard about the science behind water stress, thanks to Brian, and now we're turning to the real-life impacts, the real-life implications for people, for industries, and for the planet. I'm joined now by Shigeaki Kazama, Executive Officer and Division Deputy COO of the Sustainability Management Division at Suntory Holdings. We also have Manoj Jain, MJ, who is an Investment Director at Unison Capital. And last but not least, Alzbeta Klein, Director General of the International Fertilizer Association. Welcome to all of you. Shigeaki, I want to get started with you. We know that water stress is having a really, really strong impact across industries. And oftentimes that means that companies need to take some sort of action. We know that water is a very local resource. And that means that some of the relevant actions that need to be taken and that need to be done, that needs to happen at the local level. Can you tell us how Suntory is thinking about this as a beverage company?
Yes, thank you, Frank. And hi, everyone. My name is Shigeaki Kazama, the Deputy CEO of Sustainability Management at Suntory. At the beginning, Suntory is a Japanese beverage company with a diverse portfolio from the premium spirits, beer, wine, and non-alcoholic beverages. I think some of our products could be popular with you. At the beginning of my comment, I rely on water and agriculture, so water is a core of our business. Since water is a shared resource, we think that it is important to take a holistic approach and consider the impact to watershed, which is beyond our operations. Therefore, in addition to reducing water intensity at our plants, we have targeted toward 2030 to replenish water through water source conservation efforts and engage with local communities through water education programs. In order to achieve this target, we believe that on-the-ground practice, in Japanese we call gemba practice, is of utmost importance because water is a local resource, meaning that issues are strongly associated with the local condition. So today, I'm happy to share two of our activities. So number one, we have run this through our water source conservation activities called Natural Water Sanctuary that we have started in Japan 20 years ago. So this is an initiative that manages healthy forests that nurture quality groundwater that we will use for our products. We now manage totally 22 forest areas that totals cover 12,000 hectares, which recharge twice the amount of groundwater that we take for our production in Japan. Through these efforts over the years, we have gained a deep understanding that each forest has its own challenge, so there is no uniform approach. For example, some forests may face the challenge of ecosystem damage due to the growth of invasive species or increase of deer, which prevents plants to grow. The activity of Natural Water Sanctuary requires a broad collaboration with experts and local stakeholders, and for engaging with the local government and communities to take appropriate actions. It is very important to have deep understanding of the local condition itself. Secondly, the same can be said for raising awareness and educating the importance of water sustainability. We conduct an environment education program called Mizu Iku in Japanese for nearly 20 years. Mizu means water and Iku means education in Japanese. This program encourages children to think about the importance of water and what they can do to make water sustainable for the future. Mizuik started from Japan and has expanded to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, France, China, Spain, UK, and most recently in New Zealand. Here too, we work with local government and community to tailor the content to local conditions based on the water issue of each region. At the end of my part, I'd like to summarize my points. Water issues are greatly influenced by local climate and social conditions. Therefore, no single approach can fit all. I think that various perspectives and approach based on science and local conditions are essential. We believe that the most important thing for us is taking actions and sharing action-oriented learning that fit the local condition to local stakeholders and broader communities, and find a way to scale up the meaningful solution. Thank you so much, and pass to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aki. We now know what it looks like to be directly affected as an industry by the water stress crisis, but also what it looks like to implement some kind of like early actions and solutions on the ground. I want to turn to MJ because now that we've had the corporate perspective, it would be nice to get the investor's perspective. MJ, how is water stress reshaping some of your investor efforts, some of your investor work, some of your investor decisions on a day-to-day basis?
So thank you, Frank. Greetings from India. So the way I look at water crisis, if I was allowed to be called as, our planet, blue planet is called as blue. I think one of the contribution is from water. Now, where the water issue is that there's enough water in the system, but most of that water is not potable. It cannot be used for lots of human, animal, and agricultural consumption. And the biggest contributor of that stress is non-point sources. These sources include plastics, the insecticides, chemicals, and other industrial pollutants we put into our water system. The stress that causes to the marine life and to our own consumption is enormous. And one of the things that is much less talked about to the water crisis is the solid and air pollution, solid waste management issues, and also the industrial solid waste and the air pollution. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In the solid waste, all the plastics that we consume, all and discarded very mindlessly, that is causing a lot of issues in our environment. The water becomes less potable because it breaks into microfragments and gets converted into part of that water resources that cannot be treated using sewage treatment plants. Also, the air pollution that's there. So all these SOx and NOx, these sulfur oxides, the nitrogen oxides, they go into the atmosphere, mix with the moisture, and we experience acid rains. So when you look at all these sources, the air pollutants, the water pollution, and solid pollutants, they're causing stress in the system. They're making our water resources much less useful for our own consumption. And definitely, we are, as human beings, causing a lot of this. So we as investors are looking at what solutions are available. If science is to be believed, a lot of these solutions exist. So as an industrialist, as an investor, our effort is to look at technologies that have proven themselves enough. Can we put those technologies to use and solve the water crisis by solving solid waste management issues, by solving the air pollution issues? So we have invested in integrated solid waste management. We're operating large areas to solve legacy landfills, because the rainwater comes into those, the leachate from that landfills goes into the water table. of course, makes the water not potable. So there are solutions that we're investing in to solve those solid waste management. Then the flue gas desulfurization plants, we are investing in, we're considering large investments into it. Not only that, all the other issues surrounding the materials. So when you have a material, if it is not used, it's thrown away. Or if it is used, the waste is created and thrown away. That's the linear economy. Whereas the material, if it is recycled or reused, it goes into a circular format. And that itself makes that impacts water extremely positively, because most of the waste is discarded into the water. The world, we the human beings, consider our oceans to be a big sink. And if this waste can be managed through investments, first of all, there's a lot of money. The material recovery, conversion of waste and plastic into fuel, desulfurizing the air, the flue gases, all this is very profitable business. So when we look at these issues, we are investing in circular economy, we're investing in the waste management, and that creates extremely positive social impact while giving profitable returns to our investments. So that's how is our outlook on water management and water crisis aversion.
Thank you very much, MJ. Alzbeta, we cannot talk about the water stress crisis without talking about agriculture. Agriculture uses 70% of water globally. Can you tell us a bit more about the impact of the crisis on agriculture, but also on hunger and food insecurity?
Frank, I'm really happy that you're asking this question, and I'm really happy that we're talking about agriculture and how we grow our food. So in water, we often say water is life, and I'd like to add to it, water is food. Without water, we cannot produce food, and everything that we eat today is dependent highly on the availability of a particular type of water. In this panel, we often say that water is local, and that is local, that is true, but the solutions to water crisis are global. And what gives me a lot of hope is that the solutions actually exist. We know how to do fertigation. We know how to deliver plant nutrients through every drop of water and maximize the efficiency of every drop of water that can go to a plant. We know that we have sensors that will determine how much water and how many nutrients we have to bring into a plant. So what gives me a lot of hope, and I'd like to echo the first speaker, Brian, what gives me a lot of hope is that solutions exist. And those solutions are not local. Those solutions are global, and they can be implemented locally. There's a couple of other things we need to think about, and that is nutrient use efficiency. So my industry, fertilizers, are often blamed for polluting the existing waters, but also we do not know how to do the world without mineral fertilizers. So what is the solution there? The solution is nutrient use efficiency. Imagine that you're going to maximize the utility of every gram of nutrient and of every drop of water precisely to where it needs to go and in what size and quantity it needs to go to. And that is really where we have to start. I think we are living in a world which is very dependent on precision in agriculture, precision in delivering nutrients. And we can think about some of the industries that were considered commodities, such as agriculture. When you produce soybeans or you produce wheat or you produce corn, it's often thought about as a commodity, but actually it is becoming a service. And through technology, through solutions, this is actually going to be a service. And through that precision, we are going to optimize the usage of water and optimize the resources that are available to us.
Alzbeta, I have a quick follow-up question for you. We know that in the next few days, the UN Climate Summit will get started, COP28. There's going to be a big focus on agriculture and on food. There's also going to be a big focus on water. What does that say, and what does that tell us about the evolution, if you will, of the conversation on climate change in general? And how do you think that the water piece is kind of being embedded as part of that growing conversation?
Frank, it took us 23 climate conferences to start thinking about agriculture. I think it was COP that actually finally started to talk about agriculture. So I am delighted to see it on the agenda, because before you can bring solutions, you have to identify the problem. And the problem is that we don't know how to feed ourselves without a huge impact on the environment. So delighted that agriculture is on the agenda. What is different this year is that we have a new component of agriculture on the agenda, and that is soil health. We have talked until now about agriculture. From this COP onwards, we are focusing on soil health. If you don't have a healthy soil, if that soil doesn't contain nutrients, there is not much you can do. And I think this focus on healthy soils is absolutely critical. And I think water is next. To be honest with you, I don't think there is enough focus on water in today's conversations about climate. And I think the coalition of leaders, like you see on this screen, should push for a very different inclusion of water, just like the coalition of leaders 5 COPs ago focused on bringing agriculture to the forefront of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Alzbeta, for this very strong call to action. We know that climate change expresses itself through water, so it's time that we talk a bit more about this topic. Thank you, MJ. Thank you, Aki. Thank you, Alzbeta, for this conversation. We'll be back in a moment to continue this discussion about solutions and the future of water. But first, here's another message from our partners at the Sustainability Leaders Council. This one is from Colm Jordan of Indorama Ventures and Hiroko Yano of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Take a look.
We can't be a world-class company if we don't have a world. And water is absolutely essential to that. In the last century, the UN said that water consumption has been double the growth of our population. It's not sustainable. We have to act, and we can't do it alone. We cannot ignore the risks that our industry is facing. If we're going to be a good partner to our customers and to our suppliers, we have to take action, and we have to work with them to try and do that.
The financial sector is indirectly affected by water stress through the companies it finances. The effects are shown in the form of increased credit risk and increased reputational risk. Water stress affects many sectors and many countries and is expected to increase further in the future due to factors such as population growth and climate change.
Whether it's the boardroom table or the dinner table, everyone's talking about reduce, reuse and recycle. And it's the same for water. We have a target to reduce water intensity by 2030 by 20% on a 2020 baseline. That's a hard target. And we'll only do this if we can reduce and reuse the water within our plants. So we're taking water in, we're not letting it go out, and we're making sure that we reuse it as often as possible to optimize our water usage, to decrease the demands that we're putting on the water community around the world, and make sure that we're a sustainable business, not just for ourselves, but for our customers and our suppliers and the planet.
In order to realize sustainable use of water resources, integrated efforts should be made in cooperation with various companies that share water resources, local governments, and communities of the regions concerned. GZERO has provided financial support for various water infrastructure projects around the world, including water supply projects, sewage treatment projects, and flood protection projects. Many of these projects have been carried out in cooperation between Japanese companies and host country companies, while also collaborating with local governments to improve the environment for sustainable water use.
To give you an example of how we're reducing our water intensity, we've changed the way we're washing the trucks that transport our product. And because of the changes and because we're reusing water, we've managed to reduce water consumption by 90% in our facilities in Brazil. By recycling the water, cleaning it and using it again, we've reduced it by 90%. And that's just a very small example of something that's happening across our entire operations. And we're asking everyone else to join us.
Many thanks to Colm and Hiroko. In our final conversation today, we're going to take a look at some of the solutions that the world can use and leverage to overcome the growing water stress crisis. I'd like to welcome Mike Nemeth, Senior Advisor focusing on agricultural and environmental sustainability with Nutrien, Tanvi Nagpal, a non-resident Senior Associate with the Global Food and Water Security Program at CSIS, James Dalton, the head of the Water and Land Management team at the IUCN, and welcome back to you, Shari, Managing Director for Climate and Sustainability at Eurasia Group. Tanvi, I would love to get started with you. A big elephant in the room, we haven't talked about it yet, water utilities. We know that water utilities play a crucial role in economic and social development. In concrete words, can you tell us how we can best support them in the context of the global water crisis?
Thank you so much, Frank. This is, it's an incredibly important question. So one way in which the crisis is manifesting itself is through higher water bills for consumers. And what this essentially means is that some households are unable to pay the cost of their bill, while others may just never be able to connect to the water supply. As we know, there's, over 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to a safe supply of water currently. 2 million of those actually live in the United States, believe it or not. And the cost of, the reason that these costs are rising are manifold. It could be because there's seasonality and scarcity, as Brian mentioned, and so utilities have to invest in how to deal with that. It could be cleaning up the chemicals in the water that they did not produce. Somebody else put them in there. So PFAS, we talk about them here, or other persistent chemicals. MJ talked about those. It could be higher costs for inputs like electricity. So essentially, and in many countries, a lot of water is lost due to leaks and breakages, which we call non-revenue water. So we have a scarce resource. It's becoming more expensive to treat it. It's becoming more expensive to get it into homes. And consumers essentially pay for all this through their bills. The sad thing, really, and the part that I work on most, is that the people who have not contributed to this problem at all are then sitting with these higher bills for water. And what we need to do is we need to be able to support those consumers who are the most disadvantaged to be able to pay for clean water, to be able to connect to clean water, and at the same time, assist utilities to make sure that they can serve all of their customers, not just the people who can afford clean water, but everybody. So there are ways to do this, of course. And, the one thing we have to remember is when utilities don't get any credit when everybody gets water. We only scream at them when water stops, right? So behind the scenes, they're making a lot of investments, whether that's in, technology, or it's in getting more leak detection systems, or it's in investing in reservoirs, or it's sort of minimizing wastewater flows so that they're not having to do wastewater treatment. They're doing incredible things, fixing meters all the time so that, people are being metered correctly for their water. What we aren't doing enough of is really structurally figuring out how people should be charged for water so that they are able to get water all of the time, so that they don't get disconnected from their services, so that they don't go into a crisis when they have an income shock.
A bit of a follow-up question, because you mentioned water bills. Do you think that we need to rethink water bills? And if so, what would that even look like?
So the way we need to rethink water bills is first to figure out how to support the consumers who cannot pay the water bill. For most people, a water bill should be about between 2 to 3% of their monthly income, right? And for people like you and me, we can afford that. That is okay, right? And also, if we live in smaller homes, we don't use a lot of water. Imagine that you are a family with eight people living under one roof, and you're living in Accra. 2% to 3% of your water bill is not going to be 2 to 3% of your monthly income. It's going to be 8%, 10% of your monthly income. So what we need to think through is, how do we support those families to pay their water bill? Is it going to be through making sure that we have stepwise sort of tariffing so that, they are able to get a certain amount of water for a lower price? Is it going to be to make sure that their meters are working? Is it going to be to make sure that they can, that they can reliably get water so that they're not self-provisioning. Because another problem that happens, Frank, and it happens even in rich countries like the United States, it happens in poorer countries as well, is that when people cannot regularly have an income to pay a bill that they receive every single month, they will do a lot of self-provisioning. They might go to the well or a dug well. Look at Jakarta. Do you know how many wells were dug through Jakarta because, the people in Jakarta couldn't, and there's subsidence in the ground. So the cost of not providing an affordable service to every consumer can be a societal cost, in terms of health, in terms of productivity, even in terms of groundwater depletion. So we must think through an approach where we believe that everybody should get water, not just because we deserve water, but because it's important for all of society that everybody get this access to clean water. It might be the cheapest way to get everybody water, honestly.
Thank you so much, Tanvi. And just like that, we have our first set of solutions. I want to go to Mike next. We spoke a bit about agriculture earlier in the program with Alzbeta. We know that agriculture is often viewed as part of the problem. How does it become part of the solution, Mike?
Thanks, Frank. And first of all, as the world's largest provider of crop inputs, services, and solutions, we believe that Nutrien plays a role in helping our farmers increase food production in a sustainable manner. And that includes water, and really water impacts from agriculture that have been mentioned, such as water use and non-point source pollution. They've been discussed and they are a challenge, but any human activity in this world has water impacts, whether that's living in a city or operating a business or farming. So nutrients and water are the two greatest inputs needed to grow crops. And with a large global land use footprint, agriculture has many opportunities to be part of the solutions to the challenges. And that's through the stewardship of both nutrients and water. So I believe that mitigating risks to water through farm management practices is key. And so that's really the big opportunity with farming, is to look at the on-farm management practices. And these includes things such as water management, land use management, and input management practices. Because all of these practices, they both support positive water outcomes and such as fertigation that was mentioned, or sustainable water use, managing your inputs, and managing your lands differently, whether that's putting buffer strips where they're needed, and then being able to support all of that with technology, precision agriculture, and being able to make sure that you're doing things the best way possible. But stewardship also requires looking outside of your operational boundaries. So whether you're a farm or a factory or a municipality, you have to look outside your fence line. And so I believe that agriculture really has the ability to do that, to address shared water challenges by collaborating locally within the agri-food value chain, but also across sectors with actual boots on the ground, for on-the-ground actions that make sense both for food production and positive water outcomes.
Thank you very much, Mike. James, everything that Tanvi and Mike said kind of hint at a need for greater water governance or better water governance. What are some of the key best practices to advance water governance and management for people and for nature?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I think, first off, I think it's worthwhile recognizing that around about 90% of global water policy is out of date. So in terms of finding a good practice, the key thing is to actually dust it off and take a good look at it, because most countries don't do that on a regular basis. You would think that it's something that's more iterative and reviewed on a regular basis, but that's not the case. So I think the first thing is to really understand the policy situation right now, and then be able to reconcile that with what the climate future is showing us. As we get better at understanding what the climate change is going to be like and how we go through these changes and shifts in hydrology and the impacts that has, we need to be able to better update our policy framework so that we are fit for purpose, really, and ready to take those things forward. I would say most countries are 20 years behind where they need to be now on reforming water policy. And if you think that we need to be looking at water policy now for 20 years ahead, so we can build the trajectories, that means that, we're effectively 40 years behind where we need to be on the policy calendar when it comes to being able to better manage our water resources. So there's some real fundamental challenges there. I think there are good things happening in terms of looking at local frameworks and transparency frameworks for improving water governance and sharing water resources between countries. But there's also a missing piece of the puzzle, which is groundwater, which is often something that's generally requires a certain level of different technical skills, which means that it's not so well looked at from a policy perspective or from a regulatory perspective. So updating policies, reviewing the laws and the regulations. And I think the private sector has a big role to play here because they're concerned about water, as you can see across the board in this conversation. So they're concerned, but they also have solutions and they have resources and they have concerns at the local to the global international level as to what's happening with water resources. So use that energy, use that pioneering element of what the private sector can bring to the conversation, and use, as I think it was Alzbeta who said, the actual need for precision in the biggest water user industries, such as mining and agriculture, for example, is increasing because that gives them the ability to better control and manage the water resources, but it also gives them the better license to operate in terms of what they're doing because they are being good corporate stewards of the resource. That type of mentality needs to be taken into the public sector and into public sector thinking and understanding as part of that policy review process, improving the metrics, but also improving the performance of those frameworks. And part of that does require increased disclosure. So, there's big pushes on corporate reporting, either due to commitments and targets or from shareholders and investors. But the point is that that's a great corporate and international and, if you like, investor momentum from a sustainability perspective. But it also brings good opportunities in terms of disclosure can also be local, sharing what you're doing with local collaborators. And in some cases, it might even be competitors for the resource at the local basin level. So they're actually building a stronger community of practice to understand and better manage water at that local level. And that's about direct action. So using the idea of disclosure as something that can bridge local to global in terms of action is critical going forward. And there are some tough choices to make, for sure. I mean, the concern at the moment is the push for more water storage, which is needed. And at the same time, water storage means that you are letting less water flow for other needs, including those of the environmental needs and ecosystem purposes. So that also means that it brings biodiversity risks to the situation, because when you impact the flow of a river, you impact, therefore, the availability of our natural systems to respond to it. And when you throw climate change into that as an additional driver, we have some big challenges to take going forward. So reforming policy, bringing the right stakeholders in and really dusting off that knowledge and information that we have and putting it on the right foot for the future is key. First step, really. It's a fundamental basic.
Thank you very much, James. We know that this year, I think it was back in March, we had the second ever UN Water Conference. It was the first one in almost more than 40 years, actually, which I think is kind of wild to even just say. Do you think that the momentum there is finally starting to pick back up, or are we not where we're supposed to be?
No, definitely. I mean, there is big momentum, right? There'll be some water outcomes from COP28 coming out. Water is generally, forgive the pun, but it's sort of bubbling up around different conversations, right, across some of the big water stress sectors and water risk sectors. So for sure, it's definitely coming to the front of the conversation. I think the challenge with water is that, one, it's undervalued. We've talked a little bit about that. It's undervalued, and therefore it's not getting the attention it deserves because people don't see the actual value addition of engaging with it. It's a slow sector. It's quite conservative. It takes the longest time to develop new technologies in water because of the testing and the requirements, especially when you engage with public health as well. So it takes a long time to get investment flowing in it. So it needs some acceleration. There's some great stuff going on, and there's a critical mass growing. So I definitely feel there is change happening. The question is, can we get the direct action happening quickly enough before we really start to feel the pain of this? And the pain is already happening in many countries where they would swing from floods to droughts, from melting glaciers to depleted and polluted groundwater. So we've effectively abused the resource thinking that there will always be more to come, and that future is looking a bit more unsure.
Shari, I want to go to you next because I know that this is a topic that we've been discussing many times this year. We're talking about water use and water quantity, but there is also the question of water quality, and actually came up quite a lot at the UN Water Conference in New York. Shari, what can be done in that space?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, this was one of the major takeaways from this global water discussion that you alluded to just a second ago in March. It's not just about the water use, it's also about the water pollution, because of course, less and less water means that people are going to be focusing more on the water quality. And so while I think that we've heard a lot, and I fully agree that governments are going to be behind the ball in these holistic approaches toward water stress, James noted already about 20 years behind, we're going to see increasing regulations specifically on pollution. This links, I think, to Tanvi's point about cost, because where citizens are going to have to pay more, that's where governments start to respond. So the EU, of course, is within most environmental regulations, they're leading the way. They have has a water framework directive that was launched in 2000, and it has legally binding targets for river basins to achieve kind of good status by 2027. It's a good policy, but I think the implementation is probably going to be where they're going to fall down. I think we're also going to start to see specific regulations around chemicals inside of water use. And this gets to something that MJ noted in the prior panel, that there's chemicals that are seeping into the water, such as the PFAS, what's known as these forever chemicals. And the European Chemicals Agency is compiling proposals from countries like Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, to limit the production and use of close to 10,000 of these types of chemicals. So even, but I want to say that even where we're not going to see some of the regulations, you're going to see some reputational risk in terms of water use, because water is so integral to people. You're going to see what reputational risk if a company is using water, even if they have the legal right to do it, if they're taking it away or they're polluting a source. It's something that's incredibly visible as people use it, and it's something the press can pick up on pretty quickly, and it affects companies' license to operate. But I want to also say that even before we see some of the regulations, companies are going to need to start to think about this. And I think that we're hearing this. We heard this from both Mike and Alzbeta on how companies are starting to focus on water, even in the absence of regulations. And some of this has to do with, I don't think it's only because I think they see that a lot of it is coming, as do investors. And investors are starting to ask for disclosures. This is part of a lot more broad environmental disclosure trend. And it's happening now because water management isn't something that companies are going to do for the good of the world, regardless of whether the individuals believe that that's something that they should do. The companies will tend to also do it because it is a fundamental business risk to companies. So you're going to see investors looking at this already. There's a campaign led by CERIS, the Global Investor Network, to get large companies to manage water-related financial material risks. So companies are already looking at this. I think that as companies think about water stress and risks, we also have to think about the quality and how it plays out in terms of the disclosures, the regulations, and the community implications.
So more disclosures coming in the way of companies and more transparency around that topic. Kind of reminds me of the trajectory that we saw on the climate side, what we're also now seeing on the biodiversity side, and it's now very clear that it's coming into the water realm. I'd like to give each of you a chance to say, I guess, something a bit more optimistic. What are you most optimistic about when it comes to all the solutions that you presented, so we can end this program on a great note? Tanvi, I want to get started with you.
So I think at least in the United States, where I live, we have a generational opportunity here with the Infrastructure Act. There's a requirement, there's money going into replacing lead pipes, into putting in pipes. But for me, I think one of the most inspiring things and one of the challenges and opportunities is that 40% of all of the investment is going into disadvantaged communities. And that just basically says, okay, these are communities that have faced water shortages or no sewage treatment or terrible quality water for a generation, and we can no longer ignore them. We must put them front and center of our investments. So I think this generational sort of opportunity to make an investment in water is, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's sort of a bright thing on the horizon. Yep.
Thanks, Tanvi. Mike, you're up next. What are you most optimistic about?
I'm most optimistic just from the interest that I hear from the farming community about their willingness and desire to be part of water solutions, not just for their farm, not just for their area, but for the the agri-food industry, and willing to and wanting to partner with industry and wanting to tell their water story, because they're already doing a lot, and sustainability is a continuous improvement, and they're very excited about those continuous improvement opportunities.
Thanks, Mike. James, over to you.
I think the fact that we're in this sort of water crisis right now, it's been a slow burn to get to where we are, but now the reality is hitting, we're seeing the action that's required as a consequence of that, right? So we're seeing movement, we're seeing momentum, we're seeing a range of stakeholders at different scales all look at how can they respond to this, how can they plan and prepare for the future. So that's a really positive move. No one's sitting back thinking it's somebody else's problem to solve. You've got a range of different stakeholders and different types of organizations moving on it. That's a really big positive. I think also, sort of slightly ironically, I think integrated reporting and that type of push as well, both in the corporate world, but also looking at that from a public sector perspective, is also going to be creating change, because it's going to mean that you're using the investments you've made in improving water stewardship or improving biodiversity actions. You've got that type of architecture that you've invested and created already. So why not lump into that process water and or biodiversity, carbon opportunities, as well as pollution reduction opportunities? So using that approach and the sustainability agenda much more, and using and being able to bring water in on the coattails of other things that have had more attention so far, in particular climate, and also the link to biodiversity, is a real opportunity, because I think we can then start to tackle and understand the interplay with these topics and sustainability in a more broader sense. And I think that's a real positive.
Thank you, James. What about you, Shari?
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say something very similar to what James just said. We talked to a lot of companies, and what trend that I'm seeing is that the companies are starting to think about how to approach a lot of the different environmental challenges as one holistic challenge. I think the companies are moving far ahead of regulations in terms of this, in terms of thinking of biodiversity, water, climate, all in the same package. And to me, that's one of the most optimistic trends that I've seen.
Thank you, Shari. And that concludes this hour on the growing water stress crisis. Thank you all for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Really, really appreciate it. To find out more about programs like this one from the GZERO Media team, head over to gzeromedia.com/events. You can also check out the Sustainability Leaders Council page on the Eurasia Group website, eurasiagroup.net. A big thank you as well to all of the SLC members and partners. I want to do a special shout out to Suntory Holdings, Indorama, JBIC, Fubon Financial, Taiwan Mobile, Sumitomo Corp, and Unison Capital. Thank you all for your support. And thank you all for watching us at home or at work today across the world. I know we have people joining us from all sorts of locations and geographies. We really appreciate it. Have a great day or rest of your evening, wherever you are.